All right, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Competency-Based Education, Comprehensive Learner Records, and Record Standards. Just a quick note on logistics. We're using GoToWebinar, obviously. You do not have the ability to enter chat to the entire audience. However, if you do have a question either for me related to a technical issue or for the presenters, on your webinar dashboard, there's a questions tab and you can type those in there and we will address those questions either at the end of the webinar if they're for the presenters, or I'll direct you directly rather if it's a technical issue. Also, as a heads up, Michelle Sandlin she's currently in a stormy situation, literally a stormy situation. So her audio may cut out occasionally, and if it does, we'll jump in. But just know that it's likely not an issue on your end if you don't hear her briefly. So without further ado, I'd like to just introduce our presenters really quickly. We have Michelle Sandlin, who is the co-chair of our competency or CBE work group at AACRAO, and then Joellen Shendi, who is also the co-chair, or the other co-chair, and she now works for Workday. She was previously at UMUC. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're hopefully take about 30 to 40 minutes to go through all the slides, and then give you plenty of time to ask questions. We need to give you a little background first. Hopefully everyone can see the workgroup member screen. We wanted to give a call out to all of these member institutions that were involved in this portion of the project. Particularly, we wanted to give a huge thank you to CBEND. We couldn't have completed this project without their assistance. For those of you who don't know CBEND, it's the Competency-Based Educational Network. They launched in about 2014. And if you are a current CBE provider or thinking about offering competency-based education, you need to check out CBEND. It's an amazing organization that's growing fast, that is totally dedicated to the competency-based education. Three others we wanted to point out on this screen, you'll notice are a little different and they're listed as advisors. That's Brandman University, University of Wisconsin Extension, and the University College. These three institutions were involved in phase one. What we're going to be showing you today is the standards that was a component of phase two. Phase one actually started in 2015 and went through 2017. It is a Lumina Grant, and based on the success of that first phase is how we got to this second phase. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about all of that, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background about that because phase one was critical to how we got to where we are today. What phase one included was AACRAO partnered with NASPA. That's the National Association of Student Professional. That's the student affairs folks. We partnered with them to launch this project and obtained a Lumina Grant. What we did at the time and what the grant provided for was to select 12 institutions across the US that represented all of higher ed in the US. It was a daunting task. We were successful and were able to achieve that. And the goals of that first phase was to produce at least 5 to 6 working models for competency, for a comprehensive learner record. And we were able to accomplish that. Before I move to the next slide, real quick, Joellen and I, through the rest of the presentation, are going to refer to everything as CBE and CLR, just in the matter of saving time and because we love our acronyms in higher ed. Okay. Oh, going the wrong way. Okay. What is this Lumina Grant Collaborative all about? As I said, this is phase two of the grant program. This grant started in 2017, and we're hoping we'll be able to wrap this one up in 2020, or possibly it might dip into 2021. But what is this all about? It's to focus on the development and implementation of a single learner record. CLRs, this is the third iteration of the name. During phase one, we started with extended transcript. And for those of you registrars that are listening in, you know, that's not a good idea to use that word. So we quickly moved away from that, and it was originally called a comprehensive student record. And then we got to a comprehensive learner record as it expanded, and the comprehensive learner and the grant grew. But what this does is it seeks to capture, record, and communicate learning when and where it happens. When and where it happens, no matter where in the student's higher education experience. As many of you know, students learn a lot in just the out-of-class experiences that they have while they're in college, as well as the in-class. So what this record does is it looks at, it's very outcomes focused and outcomes based on whether it's in class or out of class, so courses, programs, degrees, as well as anything outside. So as we talk through this, there's university or college sanctioned outside experience, as well as not sanctioned, so such as a job or work or something like that. If you want to see the overall report on the initiatives, there is a link down below, and you can find all of this information you'll be able to find on the AACRAO website. And this collaborative group under CBEN is also listed on their website as well. So what is this thing? What is a comprehensive learner record? It is an official institutional record that comes from the institution. So it is official. It is a three-dimensional record. It is electronic, so you can dive down deeper through links to get to a lot more information if you wish to, but it focuses on the outcomes and what the student learned. And it is throughout the educational experience. In this second phase of the project, three main areas came out, and they were also relevant in phase one too, but what they're learning through coursework, and that's where CBE comes to light. Co-curricular experiences, and that highlights the relationship that we have with NASPA, because they have been working in this area for a very long time about documenting co-curricular experiences in higher ed. And even though these experiences occur at the same time, but a lot of times it's outside of our institutional realm, and we're not paying attention to or recording any of that, even though Student Affairs has been very focused on this, and students have requested it over time as well. So they're focused on any and all of the above. You'll see, we're going to show you one example towards the end that kind of highlights all three of these areas. But for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to focus on the CBE, which in the 12 original phase one, those three institutions that were advisors actually did CBE records in phase one. Why do we need record standards for CBE? For those of you that are doing CBE, you know this is CBE is based on demonstrated mastery of knowledge and skills, and it's not necessarily tied to timeframes or frameworks. So what we typically transcript according to terms. Okay, let me back up to the beginning of this slide. So for those of you that are doing CBE or delving into it or thinking about it, you know that CBE is based on demonstrated mastery of knowledge and skills. It's not traditionally tied to what we know is frameworks and timeframes for transcripts. So it might not fit into a traditional transcript such as terms, courses, grades, and credits. And it is very outcomes focused. So that's why there was a need that really became highlighted out of phase one for the three schools that piloted this, that there was no standards for this. CBE is evidence-based, so standards or rubrics they're needed to capture the evidence so we can demonstrate competence. That the traditional way of doing this did not capture any of that, didn't have a method for doing that. Technologies and record standards currently don't exist for CBE, although I would say phase one from 2015 and the first three schools piloted this, and there were other schools across the country that are doing this also. This has gained a lot of traction very quickly. So there's a lot, particularly technology vendors, because that was one of the big deficiency areas out of phase one, that are really in this space now and looking to improve how we do records for CBE. So it's really fast growing, really is. So what we're going to present to you is a report that culminated from this work group's work over the last 18 months, focused on coming up with standards for CBE, comprehensive learner records. Do need to give a little credit here to CBIN, because we partnered with CBIN back in 2016 on this project for the launch of phase two, and CBIN had already done some of the work on this to get it started. So when we merged with them on this project, they already kind of give us a launch pad to start from, which was really helpful in expediting this project. Okay, a little bit about phase two that we're in now. This phase two has 4 parts to it, and that came out of what the results out of phase one. Phase one, as I said, was 12 colleges across college universities across the United States. In this second one, Lumina asked us to step it up pretty big based on the results out of phase one. So we are working now of scaling up to 150 colleges and universities across the US. We have been working with some individual one-off institutions as well as some statewide projects, as well as to launch CLRs within a state system. The second goal of this phase two was to get some standards down for CBE education, and to get at least 10 participating. And as you can see from the very first slide, we were able to do that thanks to our partnership with CBIN. And those institutions were all actively involved in building out this report that we'll also give you the link to at the end. Couple of things about the standards that the Lumina Grant spelled out is that they must be universal enough to apply to any CB program, regardless of technology. So the institutions in phase one use different technology providers, different solutions. We're finding that in phase two with the CBE institutions that are in this second part of the grant. Everyone's using all the kinds of technology solution providers that are out there. So that was really, we needed to make sure this was being able to be used very broadly. We will say that the institutions in phase one, we used a lot of their advice of what trials and tribulations and challenges that came out of that first one in order to help us build out these standards. And all the institutions that are now involved in this second phase are developing their CBE CLR aligned with these standards. Number 3, when out of phase one, one of the number one challenge for all the institutions that were involved was technology. And it was regarding getting the different solutions to talk to each other and the data integration issue. It was huge. It was probably the biggest challenge. When we started phase two, the first thing we did is develop national experts on this issue, and they worked the first 6 months of 2017 and produced a report on data technology and the integration issues. You can find that report out on the AACRAO website under the Comprehensive Learner Record. So I advise you to please check it out. There's a lot of great information in there. But this was a huge challenge across institutions, getting all of their solutions to talk to each other and merge, particularly when you're talking about some of the co-curricular, and CBE had a really big issue with this, with some of the learning management systems. So that has been a big project in this phase two as well. And then the last piece of phase two, which stay tuned because this is on the horizon, is leveraging this so it merges with existing degree audit technologies so that all of this can track progress towards degree. And by track progress, also the learning outcomes, the competencies in the process. A little bit about the schools that are participating in this phase two. The goal was to have develop an implementation of a CLR by 2020, as I said, or 2021. The CBE schools document learning outcomes and competencies. That's what their record must do. It needs to be a digital record. There are some schools that are still wishing to have the print option, but by far and large, we are looking at a digital record, and it's an official document, as we said from the very beginning. They'll be issued by the institution. This is going to require, if you jump into this, you will need to have a very diverse campus team because it's going to involve a lot of players. The CBE schools that have been in phase one already were had a CBM program or a pilot that was developed and launched. Because of those of you that have done CBE, you know, it's not something you can do quickly. It's going to take some time to build out a CBM program. And it's got to lead to something, a certificate or degree, some sort of a completion. The launch date, and then there's been a lot of communications. And then the schools that haven't implemented a CLR, they had one-day workshop to go. They got to work with a lot of other institutions seeing a pure digital record. Little bit about the timeline. This might be a little difficult to read, but pay attention to what's down in stream B with the green bars. That's where the C-band collaborative came about, and the requirement by Lumina to build out a CBE CLR record. And we've been on time with this whole project. We don't have the toolkit built out yet. That is the next phase of this project. But we do have the standards report, which we're going to show you what those standards are. And I'm going to turn it over to Jo Ellen, and she is going to walk you through the standards.
Great, thanks, Michelle. All right, so now that you've heard quite a bit more about how this got started and what the genesis of it was and how it's kind of worked, it's my job here to give you essentially what is the chart. It wouldn't be AACRAO if there wasn't a chart. It's always a chart. The chart basically that talks about these are the 5 elements that we developed in CBEN with the schools to talk about what are the sorts of requirements that we would consider to be pretty much you should have them in there, and or these are kind of optional. And bear in mind that this is likely an evolving type of thing as more institutions produce different forms of records, CLRs of various natures. It's entirely possible these could shift. So if you do print this out and put it in a binder on your desk, just know that you might want to check for updates every year or two, or even replacement depending on where we are with this standard. So just had to point that out. It's not 100% for sure going to live forever like this, because again, this is a pretty nascent area. So what I thought we'd do is just identify the categories for you and talk about those things that we saw as initially being required, and then add in those things that we all thought were more optional. You should know as well that there was some student feedback into this, and that's where some of the ideas came from. And so where I know when that happened, I'll point it out, but there are a few things in here that you will probably, you might have a little puzzled look on your face and wonder where it came from, and it's possible that came from students. So if we start with the first requirement, and bear in mind, y'all can pull this from the web. This is your master chart. It's all good. Everything is here encapsulated in this chart. The rest of it is just deeper explanation. So this is the piece, basically. All right, so when we talk about accessibility and access to this type of a record, understanding that it's digital, there really was one primary thing, and that is who can view this thing, essentially. It could be who could interact with it, but who can view this? So one, we wanted to make sure that it was very clear that we believe the student should be able to view this at any time. 2, that it should be viewable by authorized entities. And then that the delegation of that access to authorized entities could be shared by the student, could be institutional, they have a legitimate educational interest in the record, etc. So this is a pretty broad category, but those are the 2 parties really, or forms of parties, categories of parties that this needs to be accessible to. Then we had an optional element here. Traditionally, transcripts are very much of a pull, meaning in order for a registrar or other person to produce a record, there's something that comes in that indicates, I want the record. Usually it comes with some sort of fee and some sort of sign off, and I want it to go to this party or that party, et cetera, as you all know. So the current stuff we work with is really a pull, but we think that institutions should start moving in a direction, or at least conceptually thinking about the concept of push. In other words, pushing the records out or making them accessible to the students. They can be pulled at any time essentially from them, so they can share them. And this is kind of a different model for us in higher ed. This is probably functions a little more like a degree audit in most SISs, which, you know, students can go in and do their degree audit and pretty dynamically usually see where they are. And this is sort of the same concept. Of course, thinking about what permissions need to be required, what triggering events might happen, but just then conceptually to move into the push me, pull you, to think about it being a push out versus always a pull. Not required, just maybe an optional, nice to have conversations and thought about this. Then we have authentication and configuration. Obviously, you know, some of this depends on your institutional structure and whether you've contracted with a third party to deliver documents and you would choose to use them, whether you deliver them through a system on your campus, whether that's an SIS, an LMS, or some other system. But the baseline pieces here were that the student has to somehow authenticate. And again, that's kind of up to you as an institution, but they have some sort of sign-on and they are authenticated as a valid student. That's a requirement. Also, the receiver needs to be authenticated. So if it's an employee and they're signing in with their single sign-on login, that's an authentication. If it's an external body that a link has been shared with, should be some sort of external validation. So you have every reasonable expectation that's the right person viewing the record. And those are kind of the bigger pieces. We felt like the configuration by the institution, so on the slide you'll see configurable by student. Kind of behind that, although not on the slide, is we sort of, this was a kind of a go without saying, that the institution would configure this type of record, what's on it, you know, is it for a large population, a single unique student, all those sorts of things the institution would choose. But we did think there was some optional elements here, and heard this from students, that there is this kind of growing desire for them to do a more deep job with curating their educational learning outcomes, essentially competencies, skills, achievements, accomplishments, or whatever your language is, that the students really did desire to not necessarily lay it all out for every person that they wanted to send it to, but to maybe highlight certain parts that were really representative of how they wanted to be seen or viewed or understood by the party that was receiving it. So not required again, but something to think about as an institution is how would you do that? The later example we have of the institution here, it gives a pretty good, really what is an excellent way of distinguishing between what might be student content, institutional content, et cetera. And we'll get a little more into that in the content requirement standards. So I think authentication and configuration, we kind of got it. Most registrars, this will resonate. It'll be like, yep, gotcha. Then we're going to turn to really data security and compliance. In here, truly, we for sure thought about new types of methods to deliver a comprehensive learner record. Up on this slide is probably the most popular or most talked about method right now, which is distributed ledger, which blockchain is one. That certainly would appear to be. You know, this is not the webinar on blockchain, but there's plenty of materials about and lots of discussions at conferences and amongst registrars and AACRAO and CIOs, so you can find more about this. But whatever method is chosen, it needs to have the appropriate data security and compliance. We did think that the permission granting for sharing, that's kind of it could be interpreted multiple different ways. So general, just like any regular transcript, you know, if a student asks for it and wants you to send it somewhere, there's the permission granted for sharing. But since this is a digital document, some of this stuff gets a little bit more convoluted, including if it's a digital document, is there a way to do offline sharing and whatnot? So the concepts of permission granting for sharing here need to be woven into your data security and compliance. A lot of this is going to depend on the wrapper or the security protocols you put around your record. The third one came directly from the mouths of the students, which, and I've had people ask me about it, but the ability for students to provide more of what is like kind of personal information. Registrars that send records, for example, to LSAC, the Law School Admission Council, or some of the medical schools and whatnot, know that they often ask for additional things to accompany or be on sort of the transcript or cover letter or whatnot. Students felt like they may, on occasion, not maybe all the time, have a need to specify some forms of things that we wouldn't normally put. I mean, they're not going to be in a quote unquote an institutional record, but they might be something that could be included in some way, especially again, considering this is digital. It doesn't really have a cover letter, but you could think about how you could provide, how students could provide some PII. Maybe it's an ID number for a particular, that will cue the person who's receiving it in to where it goes. Maybe there's a particular organization or HR needs that are being communicated to the student. Maybe it's LSAC, et cetera. Wouldn't really matter, just this concept that you should think about something on students' minds, which is they may have a need to add some information. Never fear, it doesn't mean it has to be stuck in your SIS or LMS. It just, you might need to somehow incorporate it into this record. It's kind of optional, but just something that the students brought up. Okay, the meat of the matter here, what everybody likes, I think, talking about, not that we don't all like security and data and FERPA, of course we love it, but this is kind of the fun stuff. So really thinking about what should be in a record as far as content and how this sort of all works together. And so essentially from a content point of view, we really looked at, you know, what should be in there and what is sort of an optional element. So for content, the institutional reference for terminology, this needs to be included. It's a must-have. So because we're talking about competency-based learning records, they're a little different. And again, they're not going to have the same types of structures as normal records with a course and a unit and a grade. You really need to explain somewhere, no matter where you put it, what's the kind of hierarchy of the, you know, what's a program competency, what might be smaller skills and competencies, are there tasks, what's the program the student's in, how do you grade, all those sorts of things need to be in a reference, because it is likely someone looking at this may not have the full picture of your program. You could include, it's digital, remember, so if you use a standard language like JSON LD that provides the ability to link data, could certainly have things like links to websites, credential engine, other sources for information about particular programs. Then we have the grade or mark of proficiency or level of performance. So in competency-based education, some schools choose to use grades and some schools don't use grades. The mastery learning concept means that all of the content of the course has been mastered at the level the school has set. So pretty much for the most part, for most folks, that's a C or a B, commonly 70, 80%. So there isn't really any content that isn't mastered. That's how CBE works. But we need to make sure that whatever mark we're giving the student, that's spelled out. So you could have mastered, you could have proficient, you could have high scholarship. It's kind of up to you as an institution, but that sort of takes the place of what we would normally use a grade for. Again, your institution could choose to use grades, that's not prohibited, but just make sure whatever you use, whatever grade or mark is on there. The competency statement, which is the competency essentially, needs to be in the record, right? So it could be a short name, could be a full statement. The only thing we would say, higher ed, as you might know, has a tendency for academic verbiage and long academic verbiage, especially those of you who have to put course titles and descriptions in systems. That probably sounds very familiar. So Just make sure whatever you have here is as user-friendly as it can be, bearing in mind that this record is designed to be released to anybody, whereas the traditional transcripts audience is predominantly other educational institutions, not exclusively, but by a large majority. I think the latest out of Parchment was somewhere around 80+% transcripts go to another educational institution who is very familiar with higher ed language and whatnot. So these records are designed to be, or should be designed to be, shared with whoever the student wants to share with. They may not speak academic, so just make sure it's friendly. Then some sort of a date. One of the things that often gets questioned in competency-based education is it is usually more self-paced. In other words, the student, him or herself, starts the program and finishes up in a unique time frame. And so be cautious when thinking about this, because if it's taken the student 9 months, for example, to pass a mathematics competency, the last thing you would want to do is imply somehow that there was a deficiency because it took so long. Alternatively, if someone passed the content in a couple of weeks, if your program runs that way, that also might, there's also pieces in there that you would want to explain. So I think what we all settled on is you don't necessarily have to have the date started, but you should have the date completed. So there's some frame of reference of when that competency was earned. Then the additional stuff that you might include, but you don't have to, is you can include additional content from student. And again, we're going to see how this works in the example Michelle and I are going to talk about, whether that's a micro-credential or artifacts to learner records or anything that the student, him or herself, might want to submit. That's up to you as an institution, but that content would be optional. Obviously, official and unofficial versions, you should have an official version. Unofficial just might be somebody's viewing it, like the student, him or herself, if you want to send it to somebody, but making that distinction is helpful. This is not quite like a regular transcript, so that unofficial and official is a little different, but officially, sent to the person with security and whatnot, we consider that official. You can have evidence of learning. So for example, you could do deep linking or integration with ePortfolio solutions, or you could have things hosted behind your firewall. So probably really common for folks that do not even have competency education is many grad programs, certainly doctorate, have theses that are stored in the library, which are now frequently stored digitally. So you could include, for example, a link to something like that, or you could deep link artifacts from the student record. So that may be something that comes from a learning management system that speaks to the student's competency. Maybe they gave a speech, wrote a paper or a briefing, anything like that. The other things are, if you wanted to add faculty information, you could do so. Some schools will want to do that, some schools won't. So, and it's not really that different than the current transcript. Some schools have faculty names on them, some schools don't. That's up to you. And then optional, but for those schools who are doing CBE via direct assessment, know that the Department of Ed still wants to have a credit equivalent sort of in the background so they can handle it in terms of a financial aid pieces and other pieces. So if you want to include that in your formal record, you could certainly include it if there is a credit equivalent. That's an optional element. It's not required, but up until the time when we are comfortable, basically as an industry, turning competencies into currency versus credits, I think this credit equivalent will probably always be something that some people want to have or would facilitate that record intake from the receiver and being able to actually use that record, particularly for higher ed. Then we have the different sorts of documentation and formatting. This is our last category. It's probably our richest. So we can start at the very top and think about digital. So HTML, PDF, are you gonna do this in, again, like JSON LD as a form of language? This is all up to you, but the only print option we really see is like print the PDF, because really this is a digital first document. It's not the translation of paper to digital, which the regular transcript is, because we had the regular transcript for hundreds of years before we got digitalized and we were our own digital me's. We know, yep, you want it printable. We heard you. Probably the student does too. But again, digital record. If you're going to use a PDF, we recommend, if you're going to send that out as official, you apply security protocols. Again, third-party vendor, yourself, doesn't matter. That would be a secure sort of document. Digital record, just keep in mind there are expiration dates for a lot of hyperlinks. So if you're going to use hyperlinks, you're going to really have to know where you put them in and where they're coming from, and if there is an expiration date, and figure out how you want to represent them. Of web content availability, so there's the World Wide Web, W3C has a web content accessibility guide. Most institutions are already using a lot of this on websites. We recommend you talk to the folks responsible for this at your institution. Make sure anything you're providing is accessible and available pursuant to any sort of regulatory or legal requirement. Next, mobile friendly with responsive design. Keep in mind that this is going to be viewed probably on a smartphone, right? Maybe on a tablet, possibly on a computer, but most likely on a smartphone. So whatever you create, make sure that the student doesn't have to zoom in and out all over the place, and it's really not friendly for mobile. This is a little bit, I think, different than a lot of institutional stuff is still on websites, so that aren't actually great at making this really friendly for mobile, although it's certainly doable. So just really think about this. We had a student who just wanted to use the Apple Watch with a QR code. That's what he wanted. He's like, why can't I do that? I just want to like click my watch or scan my watch and I'm done. Like the document's sent. So that's what's in students' head, particularly younger students. That's where they sort of see this. Much like you do what you can do with an Apple Watch boarding for your flight, etc. They really are thinking of this as in the same type of way they're thinking about those sorts of things. You could include, if you want, badges and other certifications. That is one of the optional elements and completely up to you. There's open badges standards out there that will help you with in terms of badges, but if you did want to include those things, you could. You could include assessments and feedback and rubrics and more deep faculty pieces should you want as well. That's a little bit more in the content, but you could do that. That's up to you. This document needs to be machine readable, because if it's going to go to any form of a hiring manager or an HR part of an organization, they are going to ingest this possibly through an applicant tracking system or another technological tool that's going to look for things like content and keywords, etc. And you need to make sure that it's searchable in that way. It's probably going to require some deeper work with your IT department. Just to be sure what you've got is machine readable enough so that when the student submits it or sends it or shares it, that it can be consumed by a machine and is not limited to just human eyes. And that sort of goes the same, searchable via electronic means, same thing. So if the student wanted to put it out on a website, that it would pop up and search if they want to. That's them sharing their own record. That's not you having a FERPA issue. Whatever they want to do with it, the ability to search it, basic search and find, likely we'll end up with more sophisticated measures, but it's really much the same as machine readable, searchable. This is a digital world. We need to make it so it's digitally discoverable. And if you have an interest in that, you can go way deep into the technology, which I won't go into here. The last thing is it should be visually appealing. It should, you should really apply some UI or UX or GUI or whatever best practices here to make sure that it is really visually represents your institution, your brand, and your learner as well as it can. It is not limited to the same sorts of things that we've always been limited in terms of official transcripts. I mean, it's kind of hard to make official transcripts super visually appealing because the content doesn't change. It's just sort of a mostly chronological listing. So this is your chance to really think about what a 21st century digital me representation could look like. especially in light of, I mean, we don't usually do a lot of colors on transcripts other than maybe a background color and a seal, but think about the ways that you could brand this sort of visually rich sort of document for your institution, for your student too, but it really is a nice sort of marketing piece of your students and your alumni from your institution. And that's essentially the 5 categories, required versus optional elements, summed up in the chart again, and all with a little more detail in the paper. And I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to talk about an example where you will see a lot of these required and optional elements contained.
Thank you, Joellen. There we go. So we wanted to show you, so it kind of gels more if you can actually see a real CBE CLR. So we wanted to show you Brandman University because it depicts a lot of what Joellen just went over for the standard areas. What they did was quite unique. And how they built out this model was in 3 categories. So Joellen was referring to a lot of requirements versus optional elements. And Brandman actually did that. So they have 3 categories for their CLR. And at the top it says Comprehensive Student Record. Remember, that was the name back when a couple of years ago. But the first 2 are university verified. The third one is not. We're going to show you exactly what this looks like. But what differs from the first verified and the second verified is that the first one was a direct feed. This had to do a little bit with the technology. So they're a banner institution. So this is everything that was coming directly from courses, programs, the badges that they had, everything that was already built into the banner system that was direct feed. So they didn't have to worry about any of that. The second one, how that varies is, this was the some of the feed that was coming through internships, organizations, memberships, some of the, we were talking about the NASPA partnership and so that some of the co-curricular stuff, some of that was coming through this way, where it was verified, maybe not necessarily through the registrar's office, but it was verified by other offices on campus that they had gone through a process to make sure everything was validated. The third was unverified, and this was very unique and very different, but it's really catching on quite quickly across the country. And this is where the students can submit documents. Joellen was talking about attaching artifacts, their thesis, other things. That's kind of the direction this is going. So they can upload additional information. You see the list there, portfolio, volunteer activities, other kinds of certifications. To show you the verified record, this is what their verified record actually looks like. So you'll see at the top, it's the demographic information, who this student is, what they're pursuing. And then you see that they went with a badging model. And then you see there their buckets. This is their framework for how they're categorizing all of their areas. And then as you click on each one of those areas, you get a lot more detailed metadata. Description of what it is, what the criteria was, what was the evidence. And you can click even further than that. They've got another iteration of that now. If you look a little down below their main badge buckets, you'll see certifications and relevant experience. So this student listed an internship as a court clerk. So that was information that the institution could verify because it came through a course because it was an internship. What you see on the unverified, here's a great example of a student being able to upload a portfolio, some additional personal information. So you see on the left-hand side, a student did some photography, so uploaded some of the photographs they had taken, research projects. And then if you see on the right-hand side, here is where they can actually build out a profile. Where they can put in this information that's not going to be verified by the institution. And for this particular student, the accolades button that's down below where they could list, they won a Nursing Assistant of the Year award, was a really big deal. And it also gave her a launching pad to talk from in an interview. And we heard that from multiple institutions, particularly in phase 1, that the student feedback from the institutions that did student reviews, the student found this incredibly helpful to help them do better in interviews when they were interviewing for positions and jobs. So that, Joellen, do you want to add anything on the Brandman model?
No, but I think it just is a really good example of the, using the feedback from the students, which we would very strongly recommend you get, to actually make changes and produce something that is really useful for the student and can be useful even in a formative manner, meaning that the student could start this in the very beginning of their educational career versus waiting until the last term to visit a career center, and could be using this as they go through, just to keep on pace with what they've accomplished. We know persistence, right, is strongest when the student, him or herself, is confident in that they can do it. And these sorts of things, even though we look at them as records, don't dismiss the possibilities for the students from the beginning, and that they're really creating who they are through these documents in college. So there's a great utility for them. I think Brandman demonstrates this, remarkably.
Yes, yes. Where you can find the final reports, there's a lot more detail in the final report. It is listed on the AACRAO website and the CBEN website, so there's where you can find it. Either site you can go on and just do a quick search for CBE CLR, and you can find the records. And this will be this PowerPoint will be available to you, as you can see from the information for the webinar. Real quick, just we wanted to show you and give another shout out to this great work group that helped pull this together in an amazing amount of time. Fantastic group to work with. And all our CBE schools, there's CBE members, AACRAO members, and are building out a CBE CLR. And with that, any questions for us?
Yeah, we have a few questions there. Just again, I wanted to say thank you to Michelle and Joellen for chairing this work group, and obviously to the work group members themselves, and to the Competency-Based Education Network for their work in supporting this. It's been great. Just as another heads up, this webinar has been recorded and is still being recorded, obviously. So if you do need to check this out later on, if you go to the registration page, you can just watch it on YouTube. And since you all have attended, you'll get an email with a link to view the recording in the cloud as well. So getting to the questions, we have a couple good ones here. The first is from Kelvin Bentley, who asks, will there be a need in the future for the CLR to include a high-level view of the types of assessments that could be used to demonstrate competency, just to provide context for both, I'm assuming, people in higher ed and in the professional environment?
Yep. Hi, Kelvin. Yes, definitely. We could see that. We included the assessment pieces, which could include rubrics and whatnot as sort of optional elements. But based on institutional desire, you could certainly include more information on what types of authentic assessments you're using at your institution and what that means. So a project means X, and it could all the way include or up to and including things like the actual feedback and the rubric used to assess the competency by the faculty. I mean, really it's an institutional choice, but I think we're seeing a lot of interest in that because that speaks very highly to the quality and the rigor of the program and exactly how it's working. So I think we've all sort of talked about that, and that is a definite possibility to put in here should you want to do so.
Thanks. I don't know if you needed to add anything, Michelle.
No, I couldn't say it better.
Perfect. All right. And Kelvin actually has a follow-up interesting question. Assuming that you're familiar with the Mastery Transcript Consortium, did you try to make the CLR align with a record that had been produced out of that medium or that record standard? And if not, do you know how they differ, and if there are any plans to make them better align over time?
I only know a passing amount about, and have heard it and looked at it a little. Michelle, do you know more about that particular effort?
No, I don't. And I know that we didn't in this, in either phase 1 or phase 2, based on the requirements of the grant.
Yeah, I will say, so Kelvin, when you sent that message, I did go online and I'll try to post a link to the Mastery Consortium website in the chat. I just also posted the CBEN and AACRAO links to the report there in the chat. It appears to be a high school competency-based record, standard. I'll definitely have to do some research on that, but we'll have to circle back.
Yep.
All right, our next question is from Mickey Bush, and she asked if the CLR was made in collaboration with any financial correlation with any financial aid regulations.
Not initially, but I know there have been conversations regarding that because, yeah, we understand. I think I understand what you're trying to get to here. But remember, this is not replacing the existing academic transcript. It's not replacing it. This is a learner record capturing everything else and more of an enhancement, but it is gaining traction. Now, down the road, could it encompass everything? In possibly. I'll be honest with you, I don't see that happening before I retire. But right now they are separate. So the financial concerns kind of didn't come to the forefront because this was not replacing the current academic transcript in any way, shape, or form. Jerome, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I say no and then I talk. Okay, so that's just kind of how I roll. Yes, I guess. I totally got you. Lot of conversation about this in general, and I think again we anticipate that what we call I call it the traditional official transcript because it's kind of a toddler in some ways, a little shaky at times. That's going to be there probably for a while. The challenge with competency-based records is they don't fit into that model. So we know that though, and most schools that have CBE programs are well aware that they're probably going to have to, fit their feet in these wrong size shoes for a little while longer. And I do know the Department of Ed has a pretty big interest in competency-based education, and much like many other players in the ecosystem, so it's possible we could make a lot of movement and change in terms of being able to produce and have these be the kind of lay of the land. But we are, as Michelle noted, a ways off from that coming to any sort of fruition.
Yeah, I agree with you, Joanne. We are really in the infancy of this with that respect, yeah, to financial, yeah.
Sorry about that, I was muted. So we have another question from Mickey Bush who asks, doesn't it feel a little weird to place an institution's brand on something that wasn't that was unverified?
Do you want to start with this one, Joelle?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
The answer to that is yes.
Yes.
But, and I think again, we noted this as optional elements because we suspect a fairly high percentage of institutions, this is going to send them kind of running to the hills, not from any bad way, but because it is just such a different shift in paradigm. I think though, if we consider the fact that we're in 2019 and we all have lots of digital identification and things that we have out there, starts to be a little less daunting, or and especially if the institution is able to specify, hey, this is content the student wanted included but is not verified by the institution, as long as there's a clear way to do that. And Brandman's is a great example.
Yes.
I think this is a different type of thing. It's meant to present a more holistic picture of who the student is, what they know and can do, right? It used to be the way of the world was just kind of tell us what you took and you have this content, and now it's like, no, we need to know that what you can do with what you know. That's the more important question, and that goes beyond typically the academic classroom. And so, yeah, I don't want to talk around it, just saying it does make people uncomfortable. It's an institutional choice. Probably good to get your students' feedback. And I actually think we'll have to have a lot more conversations with HR folks to determine if this, if including a bunch of stuff, does that help or not help, and how do they take it in and whatnot. So this is still very early days, and I suspect we'll get more clarity in the future.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is if you go back to the Brandman model, they had a very clear disclaimer to distinguish between what's verified and what's not. And actually, they ran that by their student focus groups. So they had student input to make sure that students understood the disclaimer. So they did do a very good job at that. But yeah, in phase 1 and the conversations early here in phase 2, there's been a lot of conversation about that. And yeah, they're point taken. And a lot of the institutions had that nervousness about it. Yeah.
Thanks. And it just Jessica Hemingway asked if this presentation will be available for download, and yes, just in case you didn't hear before you joined late, we are recording the webinar, so you'll receive a link to that recording in a follow-up email along with the survey, and the handout will be in that email as well, but you can also download it right now from your handouts tab in your webinar dashboard. And that is it for questions for Michelle and Joellen. So unless something pops up in the next moment or two, I just want to say thank you again to both of you for presenting and sharing some of this report stuff. And for those of you that haven't had a chance yet, definitely go check out the report on either CBEN's website or AACRAO's website. And hopefully you all enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful week.
Another success.